Hello everyone and welcome to today's Australian Airport Association webinar. Today's topic is demand leakage. What is it? Why does it happen? And how can you make a difference? We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Carly Ward. This webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to participate by posting questions to the presenter, which can be typed into the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you experience any audio difficulty during the webinar, please dial our 1-800 support number listed in the chat box. I'll now hand over to Carly to begin.
Hi there everybody, thank you for joining the webinar today. I'm Carly Ward, I work for Airbiz and I'm going to be talking to you today about demand leakage. I'd like to give you a quick update, a word from our sponsors first. I'd really like to thank the Australian Airports Association for the commitment that they give to educating everybody, providing this opportunity for you to not even leave your desk for an hour in the morning and get some great insights. Their topics are amazing. And I'd also like to flag up the fact that the AAA conference is in a couple of weeks in Brisbane. That's my boss, Greg Fordham, in the photograph at the bottom there. If you haven't got your tickets, I don't think it's quite too late to do so. I'll be there at the beginning of the conference. On day one, I'm moderating a session on using airport data to drive performance. And on day two, I'll be a panelist in the regional airports route development piece. So I do encourage you to come along, and if you'd like to come and introduce yourself, I'd love to meet you there. So as we said, it's about demand leakage today. Let's be honest, every airport has it. It's the thing we don't like to talk about. Abu Dhabi leaked to Dubai. Every airport leaks. So today I'd like to give you some ideas and some strategies as to how you could potentially claw back that leakage. This webinar is going to provide you some guidance on quantifying leakage demand. It's a great idea, but sometimes if you've got a limited budget, maybe it's a potentially pointless exercise. I'll explain to you why I think that's the case. And also understanding why leakage happens and why I think potentially that's a much more valuable thing to do, because when you understand why, you can actually affect change. So the insights you get today, I'd like to be able to give you some tools to actively utilise your data, what you know as your local expert in your airport. And then at the end of that, you can actually prioritise how to respond strategically to identify what the best cases are to work on to help you claw back market share. So I guess that's what you should expect to get from today. We're going to do that by working through a few steps. By defining leakage in the first place, I've got a theory there, and then by understanding the underlying drivers, and you do that through research broadly, and then looking at some strategies to claw back, what you might want to prioritise your focus on, a case study, and some recommendations for the next steps as to where you should go. So let's start with defining leakage. From the consumer perspective, somebody wakes up in the morning and they have a brainwave. They have a basic impetus to travel. So what happens at that stage? Well, they may want to travel for the purpose of a bucket and spade trip, a holiday. They may want to travel for an event or a family occasion, or in fact, they may want to travel for business. Those are the three broad groups that we understand reason for travel to appear under. Oh, my click-through isn't working, excuse me. Okay, so of those four scenarios, let's remember that it's about the travel. It's about the destination. Travel is always about the destination for people. It's not about the choice of mode of transport. That's just a means to an end, and it's certainly not about the airport. So which of these four scenarios do result in leakage? Let's have consideration of that. Well, first of all, there's demand satisfied. There's travel through your airport. That's great. That's fantastic. You've got the AERO revenue. And then there's leaking AERO demand. That person did travel by air, but they didn't travel from your airport. They traveled from another airport. And then there's modal leakage. In fact, they didn't fly at all. They went by car or train. And then finally, the saddest case as far as I'm concerned. It was all too hard. And it's unrealised travel. The travel simply didn't happen. Now, I think that's actually the most motivating one. That's best opportunity. for everybody to extract some value and to get some more business going, to not compete with other airports and other modes, but actually to facilitate that unrealised demand. So I guess before we go any further, let's do a quick poll, and my lovely people at Redback are going to help me out here. There it is, there's an instant poll. So kind of knowing nothing at this stage, let's say, well, how much of an issue do we think leakage is? And we'll give everybody a little chance to respond, because there's quite a few of you on here. There's maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 people. So what do you think? Well, look, it's great to see those results piling in and everybody voting. And what we're seeing is that nobody thinks that's absolutely no idea, which is sensational. You all think you've got an appreciation of what's going on in your market. And it's 50-50 between those who think that they've got a little leakage or a lot of leakage. Oh, look, there's an extra vote for a lot. So, I mean, I think that's really powerful, because what it tells us all is that we're all motivated here to learn something, because we all think it's an issue. So let's just close the poll and get some perspective here and ask ourselves, to whom does leakage matter? Does it matter to the passenger? Let's come back to that one. Does it matter to the airline? Maybe, maybe not. Does it matter to the airport? Absolutely. So if the demand is leaking from your airport, then you've lost 100% of that AERO revenue. But the carrier, well, they may have picked it up at another airport, so they could actually be ambivalent. The threat to them is when it's their competitors who've picked the demand up. And for the passenger, well, as long as they made the journey, as long as they travelled, no, it doesn't really matter to them. But if they didn't travel, as I say, that's when it gets interesting. So having thought about who leakage matters to, let's understand what the underlying drivers are of that leakage. And I've been working in this area. This has been a passion of mine for ages now, ever since I worked in airports. It's been the story, the capturing of that demand, the understanding of what goes wrong from the consumer's perspective that they don't travel from your airport. So I've done a lot of work in this area, and I've developed a few theories over the years. And basically, why do consumers leak? Well, simple. It comes down to two basic factors. It's all about time and money. That is it in a nutshell. One of those two areas is the focus. It's either not presenting a good value proposition in terms of time, it's not giving people the answer that they need, or it's not giving them what their perception is of what a journey should cost. So let's look at what those four scenarios are and consider some real life examples. We've got the yellow family, and they've got young children, and it's a tough time when you've got young children to travel, but they really need a holiday. And they've heard such great things about Fiji. They've heard about the facilities in the resorts and the way that there's nannies to look after the kids, and they've identified that it would be fantastic to go because they could have a real break as a family and reconnect. And for them, the driver of that journey is ease, but also money, because traveling with small children is not easy. So travel for them is a really big deal, and every decision they make is going to come back to those two factors: time and money, ease and dollars. And then let's think about Mr. Green. Well, Mr. Green's sister is going to be 70, and she'd love to go on a cruise out of Sydney, and she's asked him to join her, and he would love to go. He'd love to go and see all his family. He's gone for a treat change. He's living in Hervey Bay. It's a great place to be. It's been high profile this week. And for him, travel is all about ease. So he can fly direct to get to Sydney, and travel is still a really big deal for him. His horizons are shrinking as he's getting older, so it needs to be easy for him to happen. And then we've got the Blues Brothers. They have got young children themselves, but every year they go away on a boys' trip, and that is their reward, that is their me time. And look, you know, cost is a factor because they've got young children, but travel isn't a big deal because they're adults traveling on their own. So travel is all part of the experience. They're not going to be deterred by a connecting flight. And finally, we've got Miss Black, and she wants to go to a conference in Adelaide. It's a conference, she knows it's coming up, there's plenty of time to plan for it. And for her in business, the biggest driver is time. So it's all about efficiency. So all these different people are traveling for different reasons. So who's going to leak? Which of them are going to ring the till at your airport, and which of them are going to go elsewhere? Well, you know what, the yellow family looked at all the options and they looked at Fiji and they found that there weren't any direct flights from their local airport because capacity to Fiji has been constrained for a while. And so they made the decision they were going to go on a domestic road trip to a beach in Australia. They didn't fly. And then Mr. Green, what did he do? Well, he found when he looked into capacity to Sydney that there wasn't a flight that got him in time to connect with the cruise ship on its departure. And he would have had to overnight in Sydney, and it was just all too hard and overwhelming for him. So very sadly, he missed out on the cruise. And the Blues brothers, well, they want to go to Darwin, they want to go barramundi fishing, but they didn't have a flight from their local airport that connected onto Darwin because of all those back-of-clock flights. So there was a barrier for them, and they flew from a competing airport that did have a direct service. But Ms. Black, we love her. She did make her trip to Adelaide from our airport, and therefore she didn't leak. All the others did. So we lost all that potential AERO revenue. So we have to ask ourselves next, how can we actually stop that leakage? What were the barriers, and what do we do next? Well, the yellow family who drove modal leakage, they need more direct destinations. They needed a departure to Fiji from their local airport. Mr. Green, he needed more frequency. He needed an earlier departure to Sydney to allow him to make the connection with that cruise ship. The Blues brothers, they couldn't connect to Darwin at a sensible time because of gaps in scheduling, so they needed greater connectivity. And Ms. Black, of course, we're not worried about because we've got her AERO revenue. So how do we actually know all of this? What do we do in order to research leakage? Well, I'd like to do another poll now and just get a sense of whether you've actually ever undertaken any market research before we start talking about leakage. So I can get a perspective of how to pitch this. So have you done market research? You know, your options are yes, I've done market research into leakage, or I have done market research but not into leakage, or I've never done any. So those results are coming in now. Hopefully everybody can see them clocking up, and we can see it's quite a broad spread. People who have done specific research into leakage, which is great, and broadly, and about the other half of you who have never done any research into leakage. So that's great. We've got a broad spread of opinions. So let's actually start considering research going forward. So as I said, I've got a fairly firm opinion on quantifying leakage. I'd like to give you a word from our sponsors. Why, oh why do airports keep issuing requests for proposal asking to quantify leakage? It's very interesting. I'm not saying it's not interesting, but what do you learn at the end of the day, and how much value do you get from your consulting money? I guess I'd like to pose a question to everybody that you take a different angle. Instead of asking how many, ask why. Because when you understand why, as we did with all our colour-coded people, you can start to do something about it. But if all you get back is a report with a bunch of numbers on, maybe it's not so easy to prioritise where you should focus. So my suggestion to everybody is to consider investing in good quality studies which ask different questions with sound outcomes, and then you can get some strategic deliverables. They should be based on good quality research, qualitative and quantitative. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then if you do need to draw things back to some sort of dollar value, if that's a necessity, then there are ways to do that. You can use economic impact studies, for example, to estimate what spend might have been if your airport had captured that visitor to your economy. And I'll just say one word here about market research, and that is do not do telephone surveys. If anybody suggests a telephone survey, just ask yourself, who answers the phone anymore? Not many people. So I would suggest that that's not the way to go, because you're not going to get a representative sample. And I really believe passionately in the market research being done with the right people. And I'll make that point, I suppose, as we go through as well. So let's go back to Research 101. Some of you may have taken market research as an assignment at uni. Some of you may have some active experience. Most people can picture the old-fashioned quantitative side of research. There's a lady standing in the shopping centre with a clipboard who wants to ask you and 399 other people your opinion. So the point of that activity is to statistically describe a market, to establish the facts and to potentially predict what's going to happen. Maybe the researcher and the client have developed a hypothesis and they want to test it. So quantitative research, most people have got a pretty clear idea out of what's involved. Qualitative is a bit more of a black art, but it's something that I'm absolutely passionate about. So qualitative asks why. You describe multiple realities and you capture naturally occurring behaviour. So that's where we probe and we understand what motivates the yellow family over Mr. Green, for example. We get all that inside of the meaning, and then we have the opportunity to build a theory and to develop understanding of the marketplace. So when you have your theories, you can then go and test them in a quantitative environment. So for qualitative, we're really looking to develop the colour, the left field stuff. It tells you what you don't know. It gives you that unique local context. Certainly my perspective through the years is that every market is different. And so it really is necessary to do that qualitative work to understand what's unique about your marketplace. You can't apply universal rules to it. It gives you the opportunity to segment your consumers and understand the drivers. Quantitative, it gets you the opportunity to test the hypothesis that you might develop after you've done your qualitative work and to measure some of those options, some of those ideas that you have as to how you might want to claw back leakage. So when you've measured them, you can then prioritise them. I'd suggest the best way to do that is to understand the last journey experience, because it's a neutral measure of leakage. So the last time you travelled or the last time you wanted to travel, what did you do? That would be the approach to take. So for qualitative research, it's focus groups and it's fuel for innovation. It's when you don't know what it is you don't know. So you're exploring those drivers of decision makers, the barriers, the perceptions that people maybe have about your airport and the brands that serve it, the airlines. So when you understand how people understand the market, it helps you break down the categories and understand the behaviour and the drivers of those decisions. So it gives you that reflective opportunity to understand the nuances of the market, but not something that's actually scientifically reliable because it's based on only a handful of people. So my top tips would be to only research locals, because that's your catchment, that's your bang for buck. There's not a lot of point unless you are a huge market in researching visitors, because they're only potentially going to come to your region once. If you convert a local, if you have a local travelling, every time they travel, potentially they can use your airport. Qualitative research requires a focus on logistics. You need somebody on the ground who's a local interface who can recruit respondents, make sure those respondents are representative of the marketplace, and you should expect to pay them. Time is money. Quantitative research, well, these days it's all about online. There are loads of tools out there, and again, I've got some fairly passionate, strong opinions on this, which guess what I'm going to share with you. So quantitative research is about understanding the volume of the market and what some of those barriers and perceptions are. It's looking back at your qualitative hypothesis and honing it down, going, all right, okay, I was off the mark on that one, but this idea, this seems to be really resonating. So you test concepts against each other to see what consumers think in a volume-based scenario. So it becomes more scientific. But guess what? It's only scientific if it's representative. So it helps you identify and see the wood for the trees of what the best strategic recommendations might be and what the triggers might be for change. So where you would want to put your focus on moving forwards. So what are my top tips? Well, online definitely works, but you really need expert qualified assistance. So anybody can go and set up a questionnaire in SurveyMonkey. The focus really should be 10% of the survey and 90% on the marketing, because the outcomes are only as good as the sample. So constantly ask yourself, is your sample representative? Who makes travel decisions? Who is the driver of that decision maker in your community? And are you representing those individuals? Excuse me. So you want to screen out non-locals, only talk to locals, incentivize participants to take part, and then basically ensure that you're not representing the views of a bunch of teenage girls who are not actually making the transaction and buying flights at the end of the day. You want to be representing the views of people who travel, because if you want to take this forwards in an airline business case, a lot of money is going to depend on this. So you want to make sure that it is actually absolutely bulletproof as a piece of work. So let's just go back and have a quick reminder of who our people are. The Yellow family, they leaked road, they needed more direct destinations. Mr. Green, he needed more frequency to get to Sydney for that cruise. The Blues brothers, they needed greater connectivity to get to Darwin from the local airport. And of course, we satisfied Ms. Black. So let's stand back and ask why demand wasn't satisfied in each of these scenarios. And it comes down to three broad strategic areas. Ms. Black's demand was satisfied, tick that box. Fiji, we needed more direct flights. So the barrier at that time in the market was regulatory. There was a constraint on capacity and it needed a lobbying solution. It needed awareness raising that there was demand that wasn't being satisfied. And the cruise, the greater frequency scenario, well, the barrier was frequency, the volume of demand. So the solution there is actually to build that demand, to build a business case, to get more consumers travelling, to illustrate to airlines that there is potential for greater frequency on the route. But you need to start with the demand piece and not with the supply piece. And finally, Darwin, the greater connectivity. Well, the barrier there was the scheduling. So to me, that's more of a business-to-business piece. That's an airline business case solution that says, hey guys, did you know you're actually missing out here? You could capture more demand if you could facilitate it with improved scheduling. It may not work for them strategically, but if they don't know they're missing out, then how can they provide a solution? So we've got three avenues here as to how we can pursue these three strategic avenues here. So let's look at what those are. Well, when we're clawing back leakage, we can do lobbying. We can look at that regulatory environment. We can look at the supply side and business-to-business cases for airlines. And we can look at the demand side and marketing to consumers. So I'd like to do another poll now and just find out who's active in each of these areas. Can we get the poll to pop up, please? There it is, sensational. So you can actually tick all three boxes here because you could be active in all three areas. You could be undertaking business to business, presenting business cases to airlines. You could be working direct with your local consumers or with visitors to build demand. And you could be actually looking on lobbying solutions and working with regulators and the department to remove barriers and to increase stakeholder engagement. So those votes are coming in now, and there's a fairly even spread, but it looks like the lobbying is possibly slightly less of a focus for you guys than the business to business and business to consumer solutions. But it's great to see that you're undertaking activity. It looks like the main focus is airlines, and that's natural because that's what the financial transaction is. Airports bill airlines for AERO revenue. But without consumers and the underlying demand, then you need those passengers in the first place. And if there are barriers in the market, then lobbying is the way to go. So there's a case for all three. So let's close that and move on and understand what activities you might want to consider in each of these areas. These are suggestions. So for lobbying, I guess I've got two ideas for you. One is an individual stakeholder engagement strategy that looks at you connecting with the people who influence these areas. So on the right-hand side in governance, we've got infrastructure, we've got the departments who control policy and planning. If you have a master plan, you'd be filing it with them, and the air service agreements. So they're obviously crucial, they're really influential. You've got your local, regional and national political members. You've got organisations like Austrade who might work with your community and your Chamber of Commerce to build demand for business overseas, for example. You've got the very traditional barriers of things like customs, immigration and quarantine. If you don't have those services in your port, then there is a barrier to you having international services. You have your local commercial stakeholders on airports, like the ground handlers, the fuel suppliers, and the terminal services. And then I guess the one that you probably have the most contact with, all your local stakeholders from a tourism perspective. Your RTO, your Tourism Australia, the hotel operators, the restaurateurs, all those people who are part of the value chain to the consumer, the convention centre. Maybe you've got niche industry bodies like diving, for example. It's worth having avenues of communication with all those people. And there's another approach apart from individual, because there's only so much you can achieve as an individual. There's a collaborative approach to lobbying. So I've given an example here, which was the regional international airports who, in the transaction to airlines overseas, were actually uncompetitive because of cost bases that were outside of their control. So they were really strong on service and facilitation because they were relatively small airports, easy to navigate through, but they were far higher cost operationally because of the lack of economies of scale. And the solution for these guys was that they worked together to consistently lobby on areas where they shared common goals. So they used multiple channels to push their message through on their own directly, but also through organisations like the TTF, the Tourism and Transport Forum, the Australian Airports Association. Working with those groups helps identify collective things that you can lobby on together. So that's a couple of solutions in that arena. The airline business case, I think this is probably the area that most people are most comfortable in, but it does come back to that market research and understanding what local consumers want. So it's doing a scan of the marketplace and looking for where you may not be satisfying demand, identifying gaps on destinations, frequencies, schedules. And then it's about being super realistic and building a business case on what's achievable. You don't really want a laundry list of places that everybody might want to go. I want to go to Machu Picchu. I want to go to Salzburg to do the Sound of Music tour, but am I actually going to do it? I don't know. So you've got to be very realistic. It's got to be a case that will stack up. And I suppose the potential is to understand that that might need to happen incrementally, that you might have to do that over a hub or with feeder services and build demand and build the case before you can actually potentially go for a point-to-point service. So I think business cases you're probably all a little bit more comfortable in. And then the consumer side of things, well, that's more about building the value proposition of your airport to your marketplace, to your locals. So it's comparing what some of those areas are that you can compete in: ground transport, parking and retail offer, passenger experience. What can you provide consumers with? How can you sweeten the deal for them to incentivize them to fly from your airport? And then having flown once and they've had the benefit of that experience, how can you continue to attract them when you're living between two locations and you've got the choice? Let's improve the value proposition and then let's market that to local consumers who can depart just as easily from one airport as another. So that would be, I guess, a business to consumer proposition. So in closing, we're coming towards the end now. I wanted to identify a case study that I think is exemplary in allocating resources across all those three fields. And it's the Sunshine Coast case to Air New Zealand. So, you know, there was never any lack of demand. Kiwis always wanted to go to the Sunshine Coast, and they did go to the Sunshine Coast, but there wasn't a direct flight. And I think the strategy that Peter Pallett and his team deployed really demonstrates the strength of the opportunity and that three-pronged approach. So you can see that the story, as I understand it here, and Pete can tell you more about it and will be at the AAA conference if you'd like to talk to him, was that Pete spoke first to Air New Zealand at Routes Asia in Adelaide in 2007, and he continued that conversation. But his barrier was that he didn't have any international processing, so he had to have a parallel lobbying strategy. And in all that time, He needed to build consumer demand. So he had destination marketing to build the number of Kiwis coming from the Sunshine Coast to demonstrate the case for growth to Air New Zealand. And he actually had to do that by promoting services over Brisbane, over a competing airport. So you've got to be able to see the big picture here and go for a long-term goal. And eventually he was successful. He got Customs Immigration and Quarantine on board for a trial in 2012 and the service was launched. And then it grew. So you can see he started off there with 4,000 one-way seats in the first year, and in the current year he's had 10,000 one-way seats. And what that demonstrates to everybody is that it's not necessarily a threat. You can grow the pie if you capture demand leakage, because people like Mr. Green will travel where they had not travelled before. So there's the overall volume of seats in the Southeast Queensland to Auckland market. And you can see that from the launch in 2012, it's actually continued to grow for everybody. It's up 4% overall. Sunshine Coast is up 17%, but Brisbane and Gold Coast are up too. So the whole pie grew, and congratulations to the team at Sunshine Coast for doing an excellent job on that one. So let's just reflect on what some of your next steps should be, having gone through this process today. Well, we've identified the 3 areas of activity, the 3 tools in your arsenal, I suppose. And I think there are some questions that you need to ask yourself. The bottom line from a consumer perspective is, do you know how your local residents think and behave? Do you know those steps that they go through when they debate how they're going to travel? If you know that, then you know what the underlying drivers of demand are, and you can start to influence the barriers in terms of lobbying and business-to-business cases to the airlines. But if you don't know what consumers think, then you're missing the trick, because you can't prioritise where to focus. So from a lobbying perspective, do you know of any barriers to growing those routes? And that one about customs immigration and quarantine is obvious, pretty obvious, but there could be other barriers. From a business-to-business perspective, can you identify what's realistic to claw back, what the priority should be, what's going to get a hearing at the airlines, what's going to align with their strategy? So ask yourself, how are you going to prioritise answering these questions to get the best bang for your buck if you're going to employ a consultant to do some work with you in this area? And I guess I'd like to give you a couple of tips on conversion. So for somebody to travel, there's 4 steps. They need to be aware of your destination. Then they need to actually have a preference for your destination, to want to go there. And then they need to actually have an intention to travel. So that would be my Machu Picchu example. I know about it, but it's a hell of a long way away, and I'm probably never going to go. And then they actually need to travel. They need to convert. So how do you get them to convert? Well, I'd like to talk about them in terms of segmentation and the ease of that conversion, so you can start to focus on where you might want to put your money. The obvious one is business. Because Miss Black was not price sensitive, it was all about time. So any business case to an airline that's based on business passengers has got a really good opportunity to have a run at the board. Airlines love business travellers. They're frequent flyer members, they travel with great frequency, you capture their loyalty and you capture a high volume market. So that's a really great place to start with a business case. The family, well, I guess the thing to flag with family travel is it's about the multiples. Any group travel where you're talking about buying airfares for 4 people becomes very expensive. Ground transport options become expensive. If you want to get a train to the airport, that's 4 train tickets. It all becomes quite hard to convert, and the opportunity cost of travelling in a single vehicle with 1 tank of fuel starts to become very salient for consumers. So they may not necessarily be the best group to focus on. I'd suggest a better person to go with is a VFR traveller, because very often they're travelling on their own and they don't necessarily want to park at the airport. VFR travel could be quite long in duration. Somebody may be going away for a couple of weeks, so they need to get a lift to the airport. So they're going to rely on their local family members to do that, or they're going to get a taxi. And then you have less of those overhead implications that are associated with group travel and much more of a focus on ease and convenience, and conversely on not inconveniencing other family members to get a lift. So VFR, it has a perception of being low yield, but I would say it's a much easier market to convert than family travel. A couple of words here about medical travel. Just be aware that whilst it is voluminous in some markets, the consumer doesn't make the decision, so it should be quite a low priority. If you wanted to change where, for example, people in your community go to get their cardiology treatment, it's not their choice, it's the Department of Health choice. So you need to have a very clear lobbying strategy. And so that's not within the consumer's remit. And another tip I give based on my years and years of experience is that in remote and rural regions, the demand for international travel is great, but the opportunity to convert it where it might currently be driving to a departure airport is relatively low. And that's based on the fact that people are often traveling and rolling up multiple trips into one engagement. So they're going to go overseas, they're going to drive, maybe for a day to a capital city airport. They might overnight with a family member en route and catch up and have some family time. They might want to go to IKEA or Officeworks and stock the car up with items that they can't get in their local town. So the journey is actually ticking multiple boxes for them. It's not just about that one isolated opportunity to travel internationally. So that is very much an example of doing that qualitative research and understanding what the drivers are in the market and then deciding how you prioritise. The demand is there, but is it realistic for you to capture it? That's the question. So talking about who does what and what the skills and responsibilities are. As an airport, I think you have all those local insights and relationships that are so valuable that are going to give an external consultant the perspective that they need to understand the market. You're locally based, you see the world from the bottom up, and you're subjective because you've got your own opinions. You've been embedded in that market for a long time. You're absolutely the person to execute the strategy and lead the relationships. But you can work really successfully with a consultant who's objective and sees the world globally and from the top down. They can give you that proxy airline view. They're from a network perspective, and they have all the benefits, I suppose, as I have, of having done this work elsewhere and having made those learnings to understand your market. So a consultant can absolutely identify the strategy and support you in the execution, and they have a really valuable role to play. And a good example of that would be where I live, right here on the Gold Coast. So, you know, a market researcher might come along and tell you that there's a big Brazilian expat community here, which there is, and it's big in relative terms, but it's certainly not enough to fill an aircraft every day. Now, an aviation consultant would make that leap straight away and know that the volume and operational complexities would be that a direct route to Brazil is just not going to happen. A market researcher has the skills to tell you that the demand is there, but not necessarily the aviation expertise. So I guess my final piece of advice to you is very much around horses for courses, getting the right skill set into each piece of the equation to help you, again, identify where to put your focus and what the bang for buck is for you. So that essentially closes my piece for today and gives you the insights as to where I think you should go about this process. In summary, it's to focus on how to extract the most value from the argument. What do consumers think? What can you realistically work on with your airline partners to deliver to consumers, and how can you capture the most leakage back and get that bang for your buck? You've got the chat box there, and if anybody has any questions, fire away. Let's see if we get any through. I think somebody might be typing. Maybe not. As I said, I will be at the AAA conference in 2 weeks. If anybody has a question, you've got my email address there on the screen. And my contact details are on the Airbiz website, so you can always come back to me on that basis. I hope you've managed to get some real insights today and some perspective into how your local expertise can really assist in identifying how you can strategically claw back leakage and maximise your aeronautical revenue. And I think with the Red team support, we can close at that stage.
Thank you, Carly, for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Please take a moment to complete the survey which has appeared on your screen. We thank you in advance for your feedback and wish you a pleasant afternoon.